I'm Allison Schwarz, Executive Director of Alumni Relations at the Smith School. We are working in partnership with Smith's Office of Executive Education to power this series. We would especially like to welcome our Smith and UMD alumni and current students who have joined us today from around the world. We appreciate your time and hope you find this a valuable source of learning. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Gupta. Dr. Anil K. Gupta is the Michael Dingman Chair in Strategy, Globalization, and Entrepreneurship at the Robert H. Smith School of Business, the University of Maryland at College Park. He is ranked by Thinker 50 as one of the world's most influential living management thinkers and has been named by The Economist as a superstar for research on emerging economies. A member of the World Economic Forum's Global Expert Network, he is the author of several influential books, including The Quest for Global Dominance, Getting China and India Right, and The Silk Road Rediscovered. Dr. Gupta is also a celebrated professor and has earned many teaching awards. I want to personally thank him for his support of this important webinar series. Next slide, please. Yes. Before Dr. Gupta begins, I want to ask everyone to please keep your microphones on mute to reduce the background noise. Dr. Gupta will be presenting his materials, and then we will save question and answer period when he is done. Please post your questions in the chat area, and Dr. Gupta and I will address them during the Q&A time. And with that, I'd like to now turn it over to Dr. Gupta.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. It's a delight to be with all of you again. For today's topic, leadership under crisis, COVID-19, and other shocks. So what I try to do here, of course, I have some examples of US companies because I'm most familiar with what's happening here in the US, but I pick examples of companies that are global, that are extremely well known, so that everybody can relate to them. But in addition to actually, in some sense, beyond getting examples of leaders, corporate leaders, how they are responding to the crisis, I also try to offer a conceptual framework from which we can look at this particular question about how to lead under the current crisis. So, just to understand first the nature of this crisis, that it is unprecedented, at least over the last several decades. It is global. And if you look at other crises that the world has faced, for instance, SARS, H1N1, Ebola, that those were huge crises, but they were in some sense regional crises rather than global. It's massive what's happening currently, unexpected and overwhelming speed. So therefore, in some sense, the world has not seen, even the Second World War was anticipated. It took years for it during the 1930s for it to build up. So maybe it would be like almost 100 years back, the Spanish flu situation. And so what this crisis means for corporate leaders is that there are many, many unknowns. For example, on the medical side, we have no idea right now that if somebody gets infected with the virus, who has few symptoms or does not become ill at all versus who becomes seriously ill. We have new information that is emerging every day. For instance, social distancing. How useful is it? Of course, it is useful, but what is the size of the impact of social distancing? Or, for instance, another aspect of rapidly evolving information is which response at the national level is better? Should it be like China or India, which is massive top-down lockdowns, or should it be like, for instance, Japan, Denmark, Sweden, in some parts of the US, voluntary? So we are still learning about that. Of course, limited control, because if you look at corporate leaders, really, who is the boss? The boss isn't the CEO, the boss is COVID-19. That situation, very different from typically what corporate leaders face. It's emotionally wrenching, so I don't need to belabor that. That's obvious. And then, of course, possible survival risk. And the survival risk is for both at the individual level and at the corporate level. will the company still survive? But at the individual level, will I, as the CEO or my team members, survive? Just look at what's happening in Britain. That Prime Minister Boris Johnson, he is in intensive care in a hospital. So that's the nature of the crisis. Now, what's interesting, or you may find hopefully interesting, is that this particular kind of crisis has actually conceptually many analogies to leading a startup. So we can look at, because you look at startups, many unknowns, rapid evolution, limited control, emotionally wrenching, and of course, possible survival risk. So then if we use the analogy of startups, then we can look at this frame, which is the combination of exploration and exploitation. And in fact, all corporate behavior can be looked at from the lens of exploration and exploitation. If we are talking about a young startup, it's almost 100% doing exploration, and there is not a whole lot yet to exploit. If you look at a company such as Tesla, maybe we can say it's about still 60% exploration and 40% exploitation, because they're still trying to figure out. But of course, they already have factories and operations, so they do have to be very good at exploitation also. But then if you look at a company like, say, Apple, Apple now is a far more established company with existing product lines and operations and supply chain and customers and all of that. And so for Apple, maybe it's 80% exploitation and 20% exploration. Or for a company like Starbucks, perhaps it's 95% exploitation and 5% exploration. So if you look at this from this lens, in the COVID-19 situation, actually, it is leading a company in the current crisis is really to lead the company from the exploration logic. It's almost like 95% to 100% exploration logic. Exploitation in some sense has to wait. So what is the exploration logic? So number one is that it's not really like, you can do advanced planning based on all kinds of, let's say, systematic analysis and then act. No, it's not really plan and act. It's almost like, a cat. So how does a cat learn? And the cat doesn't do a whole lot of planning. It's really kind of tease the environment, whether it's a squirrel or a mouse, and then see what happens and then learn. So it's really learning, so you act and learn and you act and learn, and that process. Experimentation, because there are many unknowns and you really have to let the reality, the ground level reality, the environment teach you. Empower, because there are so many unknowns that the top leadership may have no clue about. So you have to empower. Team of peers. So, if you look at a startup, in a startup, obviously you do have to have a CEO, but really, if the CEO tries to behave like a CEO, the whole startup will essentially fall apart. It would not move anywhere. So it's a team of peers, much more than a hierarchical situation. And then the logic of devil's advocacy, because when you have in an exploration logic, it is very dangerous to assume that the CEO or even the top leadership team, really, even if they believe in majority perspective, they could very well be wrong. So you build a systematic mechanism for somebody to question, is this really right? What we want to do, so that people question before they act. And if we contrast the exploration logic with the exploitation logic, it becomes very clear what the differences are. Exploitation, plan and implement, focus on efficiency, much more command and control, hierarchy, and it's almost like a machine, rather than a devil's advocacy approach. So now, to go a little bit deeper, what we mean by a team of peers, and especially in the current situation, that diversity is hugely important. And if you look at all the literature on innovation, and what we know is that the innovations that succeed, or in fact, entrepreneurial ventures that succeed, one of the major contributors is, in fact, diversity, so that you have people with relevant expertise that are sitting around the table. But at the same time, when you have, despite the fact that you have diversity, you need to have a unified system of action, because you're acting fast and in a coordinated manner. So in the current situation, if you look at team of peers at the top leadership of the company, I put medical right at the top, because that's ultimately who is the boss, and it's the virus. So you need that expertise. Naturally, on the customer side, people, what's happening there, technology, the company's product technology or process technology, or maybe in fact, instead of making cars, you have to re-gear and make ventilators. Information technology, so that if you're going to have work from home, all the communication links work. How do you communicate externally? Obviously, the operations of the company, the supply chain, and last but anyway, not least, is the financial situation of the company. So if you look at all of this expertise needs to sit around the table and bring that diversity of opinion, but in the end, come up with a coordinated response. And so, building on this, so what are the leadership imperatives in the current situation? And so number one, of course, is priorities. What matters most? Because, you have to figure out, and I like very much the example from Altasian. Altasian is an Australian company. It's an enterprise software to actually help software development, in terms of remote coordination, collaboration. And, they have major clients like, for instance, Salesforce and Adobe, et cetera, are their clients. So it's a very celebrated, very successful company from Australia. And Scott Farquhar recently talked about, how they look at the priorities. And I think I very much like what he said is, number one, he said employee health and productivity, because, how do you make sure that people remain healthy and still are able to work remotely, of course. Business continuity, how do we make sure that we don't go under? What does it mean from a cash flow point of view? Financial planning, obviously. Investor guidance, because what do we say to investors, customers? Because obviously there may very well be, because a lot of economic activity comes down, that you're going to have, in most industries, a lot of less spend by customers. So how do you, in fact, manage the customer perceptions, customer relations side, external communications? And then he talks, of course, about strategic opportunities, which is that every company suffers, so almost every company suffers, certainly Zoom, video technologies, they don't suffer, but most companies suffer. But that also may give opportunities perhaps for acquisitions. And so you need to keep that in mind. So I like this, priorities, what matters most. Leadership imperatives, exploration logic. And I discussed that earlier. Rapid iterations, act, learn, act. And the focus here is on rapid. Maybe you need to, in fact, do this cycle of act, learn, act more than once a day, team of peers, I talked about that earlier. The psychological safety for speaking up, because nobody knows the answers, and to assume that we do is very dangerous. And that's also part of what I meant by the devil's advocacy approach. You build in so that there is, in fact, a well-defined channel for people, somebody to question, are we right? Of course, shared sacrifice, because the sacrifice is not going to be just by customers or investors. The sacrifice has to be within the company, and it's certainly going to be by most people. And so therefore, is it shared sacrifice, or is it really like the 1% protects their own welfare and basically forget about the rest? Empathy, transparent, optimistic, calm. You have to think in terms of light at the end of the tunnel. And then you have to keep the long term in mind, even as you're dealing with the crisis, because the crisis will end one day, and hopefully that one day is later this year. Perhaps, once the vaccine is developed, that one day will start becoming very, very clear. And so this is, at an overall level, what I would say leadership, how they need to think about. So it's really like running a startup, but doing it at a far faster speed with far greater stakes. Now, to look at some examples of, which I find fascinating examples. One of the leading edge examples is Microsoft, how they responded in the current situation. So, think about what happened is that February 29 was the first known case in the entire US of a person to die from the coronavirus, from COVID-19. And it happened in the Seattle area. So obviously that's where Microsoft is based. And so how did the company, so right away, the same day, they set up a task force. And the task force was led, obviously, Satya Nadella, the CEO, was very much part of the team. But in a de facto manner, the task force was led by Kurt Delvene, the EVP for Corporate Strategy and Core Engineering and Operations. And now look at who the task force included. Colleen Daly, who has a PhD in public health. So obviously she knows something about viruses, and she has connections with the medical establishment, and head of the Global Wellness Benefits Manager. But she is part of this task force, and she had never ever met the CEO. So it's not that she was part of the senior leadership team, but she was included. So that's what I meant by diverse and relevant expertise. Coordinated regular meetups every evening, ongoing communications with other companies, and then nightly email updates to employees from Kurt Delbene. And so if you look at what how the company acted, is that within 3 days, think about it, February 29, March 1 would be first day, 2 and 3, within 3 days, all Seattle area employees were given the go-ahead to work from home. Also, parents, if they need to watch their children, even work from home, they can be just completely locked off for 2 weeks if they need to. But also, just look at about empathy, about shared sacrifice, that 4,500 direct and indirect hourly workers, and many of them may not directly be employed by Microsoft, like cafe owner workers, drivers, that they get regular pay, even under drastically reduced hours. And so, of course, now many companies have begun to do these things, but to do that at the leading edge within 3 days is commendable. So when I look at this situation, Microsoft's behavior followed the leadership imperatives that I was talking about. And then, let me see, pros, 1 second, please. Yeah, there it is. Yeah, so, again, to look at a frame is all behavior at the individual level or at the organizational level. We can look at it in terms of sense and respond. Every company does that. But the difference among the companies is really that on this bell curve, when you face this kind of crisis, are you at the leading edge in sensing and responding, or are you at the kind of lagging edge, or you're just kind of like the herd? And what I like very much about Microsoft, given what they did and the logic, implicit logic behind what they did, which I captured in the discussion earlier, is that they were absolutely at the leading edge, rapid sensing, given how the nature of the team that they put together, how frequently that they met, and the response that they came up with. That's commendable. Some other examples which kind of illustrate and capture what I was talking about, and this is about shared sacrifice. So this is from Disney. And so Robert Iger, obviously a legendary former CEO, currently chairman. So Disney recently announced that their decision that the chairman will forego 100% of his salary. The CEO will forego 50% of his salary, and other senior executives, all the EVPs, the VPs, like CFO, general counsel, etc., will take 30% cut in salary. So what's interesting here is not just that people are taking a cut in salary, because obviously, you look at what's happening in Disney theme parks and so on. So there is a sacrifice by everybody in Disney, but it is shared sacrifice, but at the same time, the sharing, the cut at the top leadership level, as you go up higher, even in the leadership team, from the VPs to EVPs to CEO to the chairman, the sacrifice becomes bigger. And so this shows empathy. This shows that we are in it together. And in fact, we can afford to take a bigger cut than the junior or mid-level person can. So that's commendable. I see also, in fact, this was just last night, US time, is Tesla, Elon Musk, sent out an email that people, salaried employees will take a salary cut, and that the factory workers, they will be remain employees, but they will be furloughed, which means until May 4, that they do not get their salary until May 4. So it's not like a cut for the whole year or cut for 2 quarters, but the salaried employees. And again, this is very interesting that VPs and above take a 30% cut, directors 20%, and everyone else 10%. Shared sacrifice, but the sacrifice is bigger the higher you go up in the hierarchy. And this is my last slide in terms of examples, and I find this fascinating in terms of the leadership, because clearly Bill Gates and the Gates Foundation, they are unique in terms of their ability to act. But it's not just that they have the ability to act, how they are, again, using the logic of sense and respond. What Bill Gates has decided to do. And so you look at, that they, in fact, have announced, the Gates Foundation, Bill Gates, that they will spend billions for vaccine development. Of course, according to this announcement, they are not actually going to do the research on development of a vaccine. That's being done, obviously, at many universities and companies around the world. But typically what happens is that there is vaccine R&D, and then of course trials. And then once it emerges that, okay, this vaccine or these 2 vaccines will work, then the production starts. But here, and so it happens in a serial manner. And what that does is that obviously it takes time. And vaccine production, in terms of scaling up, it's not like scaling up the production of, say, iPhones, where you can churn it out. It takes time. So what Bill Gates has decided to do, actually to do things in parallel rather than serial. Translated is that we don't yet know, whether it's in 4 months or 6 months, which vaccines, or 9 months, which vaccines will emerge as promising. And so what he's saying is that the Gates Foundation will already start spending billions to build factories for 7 of the most promising vaccine efforts. And okay, so that's number 1. But second, here is what, Bill Gates, the entrepreneur, shines, going back to his, almost like his roots when he founded Microsoft, or how VCs think. He says that what would probably happen is that, and here I didn't capture it on the slide, but, in the details, that what Gates said is most likely out of the 7 efforts that we back from it on the production side, probably at the most 2 will work out. Maybe 1 will work out, but at least 1 or 2 will work out. And the other 5 factories that we build will essentially be wasted money. But, he says, we look at things like a VC, if you expect 100% of your ventures to succeed, there is something wrong about the types of ventures that you are backing. So you work on the assumption that only a small percentage will succeed, but that success will actually be massive, and take care. And so he's saying, who cares if you lose a few $1 billion? but Gates Foundation can afford that. So
这个事儿跟 SAP 要跟我们合同有什么关系呢？那他跟 SAP 谈不拢，他实施合同就不签。他认为把整个事儿认为是。
So this is, you know, a perfect example of how sense and respond, but from the Gates Foundation perspective, how they are coming at this particular challenge. So with that, we have about 20 minutes left, and I would love to engage in a Q&A session.
Okay, wonderful.
You want to guide us?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us. And we do have some excellent questions coming in right now. We'll start with this one. We empower local managing directors to make decisions during this COVID period, but we don't think the local managing directors have a broad enough perspective to make the best decisions, so we provide guidelines for them. Above a certain dollar impact, they need to get approval from our regional level. This is not efficient, but it gives us better control. Which way do you think is better? This or giving them complete autonomy to make the best decisions they can?
Yeah, so I think either of the two extremes actually would be suboptimal. One extreme, of course, is that the managing directors are not involved, they're not part of, and everything is dictated from the top. Let's say from that, you know, I talked about the team of peers, and there I was talking about team of peers right at the top levels of the company. So then they, of course, bring in different functional expertise, but they may be far removed from what's happening in a particular geographic market. So that's not suboptimal. The other side is that the local managing directors are given complete autonomy would also be suboptimal because they may not have the relevant expertise, say in terms of medical expertise, for instance, to bring into the picture, because medical developments are taking place all around the world, which the senior leadership should have a better handle on. But I think the best approach would be in the middle, which is that you have a team of peers that I was talking about, 8 people, 10 people, 12 people. So they, you know, sense and figure out how to respond. But then you build in a second level, which was not captured in my slides. And the second level is where the managing directors, via a conference call on a daily basis, where somebody from that top level team of peers then essentially has a call with all the managing directors around the world to say, here is what we know, here is what we have decided. And beyond this, then you have the autonomy to then in your local markets, how to, local operations, how to in fact, what to decide, what to do, how to communicate. So that way you have a coordinated and still at the same time empowered, informed action.
Thank you so much. It goes back to your diversity of opinion around the table. What do you think will be some of the repercussions for companies who fail to act? Could we see some big companies not be able to recover?
Yes, I think that is almost certain. We don't yet know which companies may not make it, but you know, and part of it will be a function of sectors. And so, just to pick, say, 3 kind of examples. So one is if we take airline industry, that obviously in the current situation, the entire travel sector, airlines, hotels, cruise operations are suffering. Among the probably the most suffering sectors. Now, airlines are viewed by most countries. Firstly, the airline sector is very concentrated, whether it's in US or China or Europe, India. You don't have too many airlines operating out of any country. And airlines are viewed as part of critical infrastructure. So yes, they are suffering, but we can almost 100% bet on the idea that governments will protect the viability of the airlines. So unlikely that any big airline would fail. Hotels, less critical as an infrastructure. So it is possible, but the big hotel chains, they run through franchise operations. So in that sense, they are generally protected, but smaller hotel operations, many of them will not survive. But then if you look at retail, for instance, as things move from, already they had been moving for the past 20 plus years from brick and mortar retail to e-commerce, but the current situation has accelerated that shift. And as this shift accelerates, some of the big retailers are not going to make it. If I look at the US, obviously, companies like Walmart are thriving and will do well, or Home Depot, Lowe's, etc. But we don't know what happens to some of the other big retailers. So they may not survive. Clearly, if you look at the startup scene, which are not big companies, but at the startup scene, many of the startups, including tech startups in Silicon Valley, are finding it very, very hard because at that level they are geared up for growth rather than cash flow, immediate cash flow, immediate profitability, and things like that. But in the current situation, for many of them, their customers have vanished, and so many of the startups may not survive. So yes, there will be survivors, and there will be those who don't. And broadly speaking, I think when the dust settles, we will find that most industries have become more concentrated in terms of the share of the top 4 companies in the industry to have gone up, whether it's a high tech or low tech, that we will almost certainly see concentration, increased concentration.
So speaking of startups, this goes into another question we received. So the concept of shared sacrifice, will it work for startups who are grappling with the cash flow issues? And then to build on that, another person asked, well, many Silicon Valley companies are either seriously considering layoffs or have already laid off a significant portion of their staff. Do you anticipate any of these companies in danger pivoting to work on COVID-related issues, or is that too big of an ask in terms of agility and skill sets?
I mean, I think so. There are 2 parts, I think, to this question. So number one is, how should a startup deal with this notion of shared sacrifice? And so clearly in a startup situation, you don't have a whole lot of cash, even salaries are, people get paid more in options than in salaries, which tend to be, quite low. And that's just how the startup game is played and should be played. And so again, the shared sacrifice notion, and in fact, sacrificed more by the leadership, by the co-founders of the company, that they should sacrifice more than other staff members. That's even more important. But because think about a startup, it doesn't have too many people, maybe 10, maybe 50, maybe 100. But there, if in fact you're not able to protect let's say the staff, and they therefore leave the company, basically, when the dust settles, you are dead. So therefore, for a startup, the question of shared sacrifice is an important part of sheer survival. For companies like Tesla or Disney, shared sacrifice is not about survival. It's about actually preserving and, in some sense, enhancing, strengthening the culture of the company. Because once the dust settles, the rank and file will see that, hey, we were not just made the sacrificial goat. Everybody was in it together. But for startups, shared sacrifice is actually part and parcel of survival. The second question, can startups pivot to help in COVID-19? I think it would depend very much in terms of the nature of the startup and the skill base that the startup has. Now, some companies naturally can do that. Those that are in life sciences, those that help, let's say, online, whether it's in terms of, say, online education or some kind of learning management tools, or something around, say, cybersecurity, because you have with so much online work, hacking is a bigger risk. So So there are startups which can definitely help in this situation, but it comes down really to the skill base.
Thank you. Do you have a view on how business will change and which industries will be on more demand once this phase is over?
Yeah, so I think the answer to that is kind of staring us in the face. Is that so if I look at industries, I mean, industries, it's hard to imagine any industry at the level of industry, vanishing. Because if you look at the overall economy, whether it's on a global basis or at the national basis, the economy is really a sum of industries, and each industry is a sum of the companies within the industry. Of course, there are some companies that cut across multiple industries, so if you look at it that way, I think it's hard for me to imagine any industry vanishing. But I think what we will see is some industries become more important in terms of, we just look at the total whatever, for instance, the market cap of all companies in the economy. I think the market cap of companies in the life sciences sector, that market cap will increase as compared to the market cap of companies in some other sectors, for instance, retail. So I think we will see this kind of a migration of economic value from some sectors to some other sectors. Life sciences, for sure. Technology, for sure. Within technology, companies that are either the creators of online coordination, or companies whose fortunes, business model depends very heavily on online collaboration. So those kind of companies, those kind of sectors, there will be migration of economic value towards them. And of course, within each sector, just to go back to what I was saying earlier, there will be more consolidation. And more likely than not, is that the bigger players in each sector, there will be migration of economic value from the smaller or mid-sized players to the bigger players.
Our next question is about how will COVID-19 impact the gig economy?
Yeah, so yes, I mean, of course, there are some, let's say, analysis which say that companies like Uber and Lyft and Airbnb, will they survive the COVID-19? And my own take is that because of course, if we assume that COVID-19 would just kill us all, then it's a question that's not really worth pondering about. But if we believe, and which is, I think, the far more realistic scenario, that we will come out of COVID-19, and when we come out of COVID-19, all the reasons why we shifted towards the gig economy, those reasons are not going to go away. And so I think the gig economy will not only survive, the gig economy will come back in a roaring manner. And so, and obviously, companies like Uber and Lyft and, Didi or Ola, Didi in China, Ola in India, Grab in Southeast Asia, or Airbnb and similar players, they face challenges. They have to figure out how to survive. But I believe that not only the gig economy will survive, but the big players will survive. And that they will find, in fact, investors either on the equity side, but more likely on the debt side, debt capital, that they will survive because the investors will see gig economy will come roaring back, and these players will once again be the major actors in those sectors.
Okay. So what will the nature of the post-COVID-19 work culture look like? What will be the major changes in the new workforce? What can our fresh graduates expect in this new world?
Yeah, so very interesting question, very interesting question. I think that I'm kind of heartened by the this shared sacrifice idea that we see some of the big companies, whether it's a Microsoft or Disney or Tesla or are exhibiting, and I think this is having and will have a demonstration effect. So in that sense, in terms of the workforce, that we will see a shift in the mindset of leaders from purely stockholder-driven capitalism to, in fact, stakeholder-driven capitalism. Obviously, every company regards customers as massively important stakeholders, but employees as important stakeholders. I think that idea will become stronger. Included in that idea, and not just at the corporate level, but at the national level, in terms of universal healthcare. I think that idea will get bigger push in the US, for example, both on the left. Of course, that idea has been pushed already on the Democratic side, but also on the right, I think. So all of that. Now, in terms of a fresh graduate, that in the current situation, obviously, small companies is danger zone, very high risk. So as a fresh graduate, I would tend to say, if you have choices, that probably better to go with the established players than with the young players, because we don't know among the young who survives and who's not. So that would be my advice.
Thank you so much for sharing your advice and insights on this important topic. We are out of time with questions. There were many that came in. We really appreciate everyone's engagement here. I'd like to thank you all for joining us. The webinar you've attended today has been recorded and will include the slides, and we will let all attendees know when the recording is available so that you can review it and share with colleagues and friends. We look forward to hosting the next live webinar in this series on Monday, April 13th at the same time, 8:30 a.m. Eastern Time. Please check back with us for more webinars, short courses, and other learning opportunities from the Smith School of Business and Executive Education. Thank you from the Smith Executive Education Office and Alumni Relations. We are here to support you in your lifelong learning. Please stay safe and go Terps.
Thank you, Allison, and great to see everybody, and hope to see you again next Monday. Stay safe in the meantime.